Well, hey friends, welcome back to Equipped for Worship, the podcast that comes alongside small church and bivocational worship pastors and leaders to encourage, equip, and remind you that what you're doing really does matter. I'm your host, Chuck Harris, and whether you're returning from last week or tuning in for the very first time, I'm so glad you're here. Last week's episode on Bethel, Hillsong, and Elevation, Can We Sing Those Songs?, sparked a lot of thoughtful conversations about theology, discernment, and shepherding our people wisely through our song choices. If you missed that one, I'd encourage you to go back and listen after today's episode. But today, we're shifting gears to something that feels a little more practical and maybe a little more divisive than it seems at very first glance. Should the lights be on or off during worship? Now, before you roll your eyes or assume this is all preference, stick with me. Because the choices we make about the physical environment of our worship space can either support congregational worship or unintentionally hinder it. And we're not going to approach this like a production meeting at a megachurch. No. We're going to talk about it from a pastorally driven, theologically grounded, local church-loving perspective. Let's jump in. Worship isn't just about what's on the platform. It's about what's happening in the room, among the people. And lighting, believe it or not, can have a powerful effect on how people engage. Now, I'm not here to tell you that dimming the lights is a sin. Let's be clear about that. There are no biblical mandates about lumen levels. But the Bible does talk about worship being both personal and corporate. And that's where the conversation about lighting starts to matter. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19 says this, speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making music with your heart to the Lord. Now that verse doesn't describe an isolated individual worship moment. It describes something shared, something visible, something that involves each other. When the lights are off or super low, we often signal that worship is meant to be private, meant to be personal. But when the lights are on, we remind each other, you're not worshiping alone. We're in this together. At my church, we intentionally keep the lights on during worship. Not because we're against ambience or creativity. We've turned them off for special services like a night of worship, an adult choir cantata, or a children's musical, but for corporate worship on Sundays, we keep them on because it helps us worship with one another, not just as individuals. And for smaller congregations, like many of you listening, keeping the lights on can actually help people feel less awkward, not more. It signals that we're a family, not a crowd. We're present, seen, and together. The trend toward darker worship environments didn't start in the local Baptist church. It started in the concert world and was imported into church culture as stage design and production value became more influential. The idea was simple. Low lighting would make it easier for people to focus. It would eliminate distractions and feel emotionally connected to the music. But let's ask ourselves, are those the goals of worship? Emotional connection isn't bad, but if it becomes the main goal, we risk turning worship into a performance we watch, not a gathering we join. Darkness can sometimes isolate people from each other instead of uniting them. And here's something to think about. When we turn the lights way down, it often means we want people to forget they're with others. But Scripture calls us to remember that we're part of a body. 1 Corinthians 14:26 says, "What then, brothers and sisters? Whenever you come together, each one has a hymn, a teaching, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Everything is to be done for building up." That's the kind of gathering we're aiming for, where worship isn't consumed passively, but participated in actively. Here's a good pastoral question. What does the atmosphere of your sanctuary communicate about worship? When people walk in and see bright, warm lighting, do they feel like this is a place to join in? Or does the dim lighting tell them to sit back and observe? We don't often think about these choices as theological, but they are. If your church is small and you turn the lights off to quote unquote create atmosphere, it can unintentionally make the room feel even emptier. Instead of drawing people in, it can make the space feel quiet, cold, and disconnected. We want the environment to say, "You're not alone here." We want you to participate, not spectate. This is a safe place to worship visibly and vocally. Psalm 104 says, "Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and bless his name." You notice that corporate tone there? It's a gathering of people in a place of worship. That should shape our decisions, even down to how we light the room. Now, let me again say this very plainly. I'm not against lowering the lights when it's appropriate. In fact, there are times in my church when we do lower the lights for a night of worship, or a children's musical, or our adult choir's Christmas or Easter cantata. It can be a creative way to highlight what's happening on stage and create a focused atmosphere. But those are occasional, not normative. Dim lighting can be used well for reflection, storytelling, or dramatic effect, especially in more artistic presentations. But we don't build our theology around creative presentation. We let our creative presentation serve the theology of gathered worship. Here's a rule of thumb I use. If the lighting is helping people see Jesus more clearly, great. But if it's helping people focus only on what's happening on stage, it may be time to turn the lights back up. All right, let's get practical. Ask yourself these questions as you evaluate the lighting in your worship service. Does our lighting encourage participation or observation? Can people see each other well enough to, quote unquote, speak to one another in song? Are we unintentionally discouraging guests from joining in by making the room feel more like a concert? What kind of culture do we want to create during our worship time? And are the lights helping us do that? And lastly, have we made lighting about preference or about pastoring? Sometimes a small change, like raising the house lights just a little, can make a big difference in how people engage. And remember, as leaders, we're not just creating an experience. We're shepherding people toward Jesus. So, lights on or lights off? There's no commandment here, but there is wisdom. And for most of our churches, especially in small town or rural contexts, keeping the lights on actually helps fulfill the kind of worship we see in Scripture. Worship that's shared, seen, and spirit-filled. It's not about being trendy or anti-trendy. It's about helping people worship in spirit and in truth together. I hope this episode gave you some encouragement and some clarity as you lead and shepherd your people this week. Worship isn't about production. It's about participation. Let the light in. And hey, if you have questions about today's episode or thoughts about a future one, or just want to share your own story as a small town worship pastor or leader, I'd love to hear from you. You can send me an email at equippedforworship@gmail.com. If this podcast has encouraged you, would you consider leaving a rating or sharing it with another worship leader friend? That kind of support means more than you know. Well, thanks for listening today. Keep your eyes on Jesus, your lights on for your people, and your heart open to the Spirit. We'll see you next week on Equipped for Worship. Until then.